All right. Hey, folks, how's everybody doing this morning?
Good. Good.
Excellent. All right. So, as I was mentioning to Danny before you all got here, because Buddhism, we're gonna look at Buddhism today, and then tomorrow I'll just upload the notes because the likelihood of, and I will try to do a recording as well of the lecture, but because it's highly likely that I'll be in the Gen Ed committee meeting at this same time tomorrow. I won't be able to directly give you a lecture on Buddhism. Having said that, I'm also going to upload a whole other packet of notes called Additional Notes on Buddhism. And I'm going to put them in the same folder with the notes on Canvas around Buddhism. And those additional notes really give you a much fuller picture of Buddhism, and it talks about the different schools that we're not even going to look at those different schools today. I'm just going to mention them. But and it gives you a much broader look at Buddhism and how it's practiced in other countries and so forth. And the reason I'm doing that is because your first paper on the 3-page paper on religions is going to be on Buddhism, and I don't want you all to be hamstringed by not having enough information. So um, it's about 20 pages of notes, but in that it covers really the majority of the things in Buddhism that you really should know. It also goes into more depth in some of the things we're going to cover in the next couple days. Plus, you have some videos on Buddhism, and you have some web links on it too. So hopefully, between those notes and our lectures and the additional links you have, you shouldn't have to do any other sort of research or exploration around Buddhism to write that 3-page paper. But it will be important for you to look at those additional notes, because really what I'm going to share today and tomorrow just scratches the surface. So without further ado, we'll get underway so that we can cover this. You might hear some background noise. They're mowing the lawn out on the quad this morning, so it's pretty loud, and I even closed the windows, and I'm on the 3rd floor of Daniel Hall, and you can still sort of hear the background. So apologize for that. But anyway, all right. Traditionally, Buddhism is seen as having 3 main branches. And the first branch is Mahayana, and that's the great or greater vehicle. And this is the largest branch of Buddhism. This is what most Buddhists practice, although you may not have heard of that type of Buddhism. The next form of Buddhism is Theravada Buddhism, and this many of you might have heard of. And that's the teaching of the elders. That's what Theravada means. And it's the second largest branch of Buddhism. And then the third is Vajrayana. And Vajrayana is the diamond or thunderbolt vehicle. And some people see this as really a variation of Mahayana Buddhism, but it is its own distinct branch. And so, it's probably also the least familiar when people talk about Buddhism as well. Um, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where these different branches of Buddhism are mainly practiced. And obviously, this isn't exclusive. Um, so Mahayana Buddhism is practiced mostly in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Uh, Theravada Buddhism is practiced mostly in the South and Southeast Asia. So the southern part of India, Sri Lanka, Burma, Nepal, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam again, and Singapore. And Vajrayana Buddhism is practiced mostly in Tibet and Nepal, in the northern part of India, in Bhutan and Mongolia and Siberia. And so when people talk about Tibetan Buddhism, this is typically, Vajrayana is typically the type of Buddhism that they're discussing, but they often call it Tibetan Buddhism or Nepalese. But it is And the primary focus of Buddhism is to alleviate suffering. That's the main objective of Buddhism, is to alleviate suffering. Um, and things that do not pertain to this focus or distract from it are regarded as irrelevant. And so other religious beliefs or practices are not really relevant. Um, Having said that, it's important to note that many Buddhists, if not most Buddhists, are not exclusively Buddhist, meaning that they dabble and practice other religious traditions. Although in the modern era, there's been more a movement towards exclusivity. But in other, Buddhists often practice two or more religions to a greater or lesser extent. For example, Japanese Buddhists will observe the New Year by going to both a Buddhist temple and to a Shinto shrine. In China, Buddhism is usually treated as just one component in a religious system that draws from Confucianism and Taoism, as well as popular folk traditions. And so one of the important things to understand about Buddhism is it shares this with Hinduism, but it isn't a religion of exclusivity. And because people aren't threatened or concerned about other religious practices, you'll find people that identify as Buddhist Christians or as Buddhist Jews. And so they don't see any sort of, problem in that sort of definition. And they see that the beliefs can exist in harmony and the practices together, which isn't true for many other religious traditions. All right. The tradition claims that Siddhartha Gautama, many of you have heard, who became known as the Buddha, he was the son of a king in the northeast region of ancient India. And he was born in the year 543 BCE. And Buddhists have their own calendar. And so this year in our calendar, the common year calendar of 2020, is actually known as the year 2563 in Buddhist era. And so they begin their counting of time from the birth of the Buddha, from the birth of Siddhartha. And so they're in year 2563 in the Buddhist era. And so they just celebrated the Buddhist New Year, and so that would have been the year that they were celebrating. So the king, the Buddha's father, had hoped that his son would become the next king, obviously the heir to the throne. And therefore, he kept his son safe in his mind from anything that might encourage him to think religiously. So the father was concerned that if the son thought about religious things or concerned himself with human suffering, he might be diverted from his studies in his sort of trajectory to be the next king. And so he was raised in sort of a very sheltered existence. At some point in his early adulthood, Prince Siddhartha left the palace and went on a journey to inspect his father's kingdom. And he encountered, not surprisingly, people who were sick and old, and people that were dying, and he encountered death itself. And this disturbed him greatly because he had never experienced any of these things before. And so he began to ponder about human frailty and death and the possibility of an afterlife. And after this experience, Siddhartha encountered a destitute holy man, basically a guru. And he found this person on the side of the road. And in spite of the man's poverty, he seemed to be filled with contentment. And this got Siddhartha thinking more. And so the sickness, old age, death, and the encounter with this guru or wise man or holy man, however you want to call them, they became known as the four sights. Um, and this inspired the young prince to seek out such otherworldly contentment for himself. And so he decided to leave home, and he became a wandering ascetic. So he abandoned his princely roles and left his palace, and he became this a wandering ascetic. And he pursued more and more extreme sort of forms of ascetic practices. In fact, he learned how to restrict his breathing so that he could take only breaths necessary to keep him alive. Uh, he learned how to restrict his food intake to such an extreme level that he became just literally skin and bones. And when he achieved this sort of level of bodily control, if you will, he had this insight that these practices were flawed and that they were false ways to seek peace. They weren't going to bring him contentment. And so he gave up this sort of life of extreme asceticism and pursued what later would be called the middle way. And many of you may have heard this term, the middle way or the middle truth. And this comes from Buddhism and sort of Siddhartha's sort of journey into deep asceticism. And this is a disciplined style of living that rejected both deprivations of asceticism as well as the luxuries that were part of his princely life. And so he was trying to craft a new journey, one that wouldn't be extreme with asceticism and one that wouldn't be extreme with the luxuries of being born into a royal household. And he sat under a fig tree, which is now referred to as the Bo or the Bodhi tree, which means enlightenment tree. And under that tree, he resolved once and for all to attain the peace that eluded him. And the story goes that despite temptations of physical assaults brought on by the great demon Mara, Siddhartha is said to have prevailed by virtue of his righteous life. And with the aid of the earth spirit, he meditated throughout the night and he achieved enlightenment and became the Buddha. So, and the Buddha means enlightened or awakened one. So anybody theoretically can become a Buddha. This is one of the things where in Buddhism there is no divine being. So Buddhism is known as a non-theistic religion. And that's important because, in fact, you or I could become a Buddha. We could become an enlightened one. And this happened around 440 BCE is when he achieved enlightenment. All right. So at one moment, at the moment of enlightenment, the Buddha discovered these things. The truth of nature was that the world, the human condition, the attainment of wisdom, and so forth, and to move beyond suffering. This is what he achieved. And what he discovered when he achieved all this stuff was he saw that all human life was simply a series of ephemeral and ever-changing events that only seemed to have substance, reality, and meaning. So moreover, at the same time he was having these discoveries, Hindu theologians were teaching that human beings possessed an imperishable soul. We talked about this in Hinduism, the Atma. And the Buddha discovered that human beings had no permanent, unchanging core. They were an Atma, devoid of any true self. What appeared to be the human self was in reality a collection of insubstantial phenomena that human beings thought they controlled and falsely interpreted to be their very being. So what the Buddha discovered in his moment of enlightenment was that everything was impermanent. There was no permanence. And even the being itself, and even that soul, which Hindu theologians were teaching was permanent or imperishable, was not so. And so this was his great revelation, that all things are basically ephemeral. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because everything associated with human existence was in constant flux, insubstantial and beyond a person's control, life, therefore, was filled with dissatisfaction, pain, a condition the Buddha called dukkha. And we heard this term dukkha before. And basically, dukkha is the accumulation of suffering. Because we're not in control of anything, and everything is just sort of a series of events, our existence is basically full of suffering. Even the things that seem to be good, such as close friends, health, good food, were temporary and momentary. And so desiring and enjoying them invariably led to a sense of loss when they passed away. So when a person died, moreover, he or she was reborn into a new life. But that rebirth was not because a soul was transferred or reincarnated into a new body. Rather, it was because the intentional actions of a person's life, called karma, again, propelled each person into yet another existence characterized by dukkha. So it was karma that led you to a new life. It wasn't the soul that was transferred. And so again, karmic energy is responsible for your movement into this rebirth. So you can see here, like in Hinduism, the elimination of karma becomes essential. It does in Buddhism as well. And so karma was like a seed that germinated, ripened, and bore fruit into the into the ultimately meaningless cycle of life called samsara, the same sort of notion from Hinduism. So this stream of life, karma is the germ or genesis of it, and it propels you into it. And so again, you have to remove karma. The Buddha developed what he called the Four Noble Truths. And these noble truths were designed to be saving truths, or what he called dharma. Now, this is different than the dharma from Hinduism, which was duty. Here, dharma is the saving truth. And these Four Noble Truths are the following. The first noble truth of the Buddha is this: dukkha, pain, discomfort, disappointment, was inherent in all existence, no matter how pleasurable it might seem. Hence, nothing was lasting, stable, or meaningful. And so life could only lead to an existence full of dukkha. So for all living beings, there's going to be suffering. That was his first noble truth. The second noble truth was that dukkha is caused by trishna, one's desire or thirst for things. That's what trishna means. This was because trishna led one to have attachment to things. And the most obvious type of attachment was to physical things, such as houses or clothes, etc. But there were two subtle attachments that he talked about. And the first was the attachment to beliefs and ideas, which occurs when one's desires such things as heroism or religion. And notice he formulates religion as an idea. So if you have an attachment to it, that's going to lead to suffering. And then finally, there was a more subtle type of attachment, And this was the crux of the Buddha's concern, this most subtle type of attachment. And that was the attachment to oneself. And, or as he put it, the presumed self. So all of us feel some sort of sense of attachment to ourselves. We value ourselves. The Buddha saw ourselves as presumed. We're impermanent like everything else is. And the greatest danger is to have an attachment to that presumed self. The third noble truth follows the first two. One can end the experience of dukkha by eliminating trishna. And desire needs to be cut off at its root, which is ignorance. It is people's ignorance of their own impermanence and condition of an atma, the no self, that caused them to desire things, which in turn motivated them to act in ways that ultimately increased dukkha. Thus, to put an end to suffering, one first must have an end to ignorance. So spiritual enlightenment is a primary objective here. And to put a stop to desire, which led to the cessation of suffering, the goal was nirvana. And so nirvana really means nothingness. If you achieve nothingness, then you have achieved, in a Buddhist sense, salvation, because you no longer have desire, there's no longer suffering, there's nothing. And this undertaking required multiple lifetimes, according to Buddhism, and it involved the sort of Buddhist paradoxical insistence that the final desire one needed to eliminate was none other than the desire to achieve nirvana. So you're stuck in this quandary. Your whole pursuit in Buddhism is to find a way to achieve or reach nothingness, but you can't desire that. And this led to the fourth noble truth. And the fourth noble truth was the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path enabled people to overcome their ignorance by training them to live the right way. And so here's the Eightfold Path. All right. Right understanding will be the torch to light the traveler's way. Right intentions will be his guide. Right speech will be his dwelling place on the road. Number 4, right behavior will be for him as a straight gate. Number 5, right livelihood will be his refreshment along the way. Number 6, right efforts will be his steps. Number 7, right meditation will be his breathing. And number 8, right contemplation will give him the peace that follows in Buddha's footprints. So the first 2 steps lead to the initial wisdom. The next 3, building on the wisdom, lead to proper ethics or moral behavior. And the final 3, building on the previous 5, result in proper concentration, which, if pursued correctly, will lead to nirvana. So if you can follow this Eightfold Path over your multiple lives and reincarnations, you will eventually come and achieve nirvana. As part of that, as you notice, ethics and moral behavior make up a substantial part of this Eightfold Path. And therefore, morality is a bedrock to the Buddhist path. It involves the avoidance of evil and the undertaking of good. Without moral discipline, the holy life cannot be lived. And therefore, most Buddhists, both monks and lay Buddhists, place the following 5 precepts at the center of their life. 1, to abstain from harming any living being. 2, to abstain from taking what is not given. 3, to abstain from sexual misconduct. 4, to abstain from false speech. And 5, to abstain from anything that clouds or intoxicates the mind, such as drugs and alcohol. So how do these sort of abstentions or moral guides work? So most would insist that these precepts involve not only abstention, but cultivation. So a commitment not to harm involves the development of loving kindness and compassion. The commitment to abstain from taking what is not given involves recognizing the dignity and worth of other people, as does abstaining from sexual misconduct. And abstaining from false speech involves cultivating honesty and integrity. So you can see that this morality that they've developed has a positive and a negative, and it's not just a focus on the negative. You're also cultivating these positive practices. And in Theravada Buddhism, there's an ancient text that describes sort of how loving kindness is cultivated, and I want to share this. Just as a mother would protect her only child at the risk of her own life, even so cultivate a boundless heart towards all beings. And so the text wants us to cultivate a similar heart towards other beings, the same way the mother would protect its own child. And when Buddhists say all beings, they don't just mean humans, they mean insects and animals and so forth. One way to do this is to meditate on loving kindness. And the first step is to imagine oneself by loving kindness. Then this loving kindness, sometimes imagined as a white, warm light, is thrown further and further outwards into the world. First of all, those dear to the meditator are sort of brought to mind. Then the radius widens and eventually reaching those who are disliked or even hated. It is a transformative practice that spills into everyday life. I'll just make an aside here. Some of you may be Christians or know something of the Christian New Testament. And one of the precepts that Jesus commands his followers to do is to love your enemies. And you notice that precept follows in the same kind of notion here that we're talking about loving kindness, that one spreads that sort of principle or moral code even to those who are one's enemy. And so you find a way to love them. And so I just point that out, that there are often parallels in these religious traditions that we don't see because we're focused on our own belief system or whatever. But this is a perfect example of how Buddhism and Christianity intersect. It also is an intersect with Judaism because there's a notion in Judaism of care for the neighbor. And the neighbor just isn't the person who lives next door to you, but that's a broader concept. And so that care for neighbor would extend to one's enemies as well. And so I just want you to hear that. Anyway, morality for many Buddhists is also linked to the law of action, this notion of karma. So that moral action will produce good fruit and unwholesome action, bad fruit. And so here, karma takes on both a positive and a negative. And when you engage in good moral behavior, you accumulate good karma. And when you engage in bad moral behavior, you accumulate bad karma. And as I mentioned before, this tends to be how most people in the West understand karma, but this is where it sort of originates from. All right, meditation and how meditation works in Buddhism. The task of meditation is to cleanse the mind. That's the purpose of meditation. And it ties with the heart of the Buddha's message, that the cause of dis-ease lies in our craving in the three wholesome roots of that craving, which are greed, hatred, and delusion. And so the only way to uproot these cravings is to work on the mind and the heart. And so, therefore, you, meditation helps the mind to um, become cleansed, if you will. And there are two main practices of meditation in Buddhism: tranquility meditation and insight meditation. And I'll sort of lay those out, and that will be all we're going to cover this morning. So I'll open it up for questions after I finish this little section on meditation. All right. So tranquility meditation is not unique to Buddhism. It's a method of thought which an object of meditation is used to concentrate the mind and gain sort of singular pointedness or one-pointedness. And the most common object is breath. And so you pay attention to the breath as it enters and leaves the body and through the nostrils. And so that's one way to do it. Others might watch the rise and fall of the abdomen. And what you're doing here is that's all you're focused on if you're going to focus on breath. And when something comes into your mind, you gently push it out and return to focusing on your breath. This type of meditation has really gained lots of popularity throughout Western society, and many people that, are not Buddhists and don't have any Buddhist sort of inclinations, if you will talk about this as a practice and how to calm your body. And so, therapists will use this in therapeutic sessions. People that, engage in sort of life coaching will use this. People that do coach people on business practices and so forth will often use this type of meditation as a way to help the person calm their mind and become singularly focused on something. The second type of meditation, which is insight meditation, which means seeing clearly. That's really what this is about. And so seeing the body and mind clearly is unique to Buddhism. And this is a practice that is internal to Buddhism. And it's distinct from altered state of consciousness. So it aims to direct, its aim is direct verification of the Dharma through observation of the body and mind. So one way Buddhists do this is bare attention. Or choice awareness. And this is a form of mindfulness that emphasizes being present in the moment. And so whatever arises in your mind or the body becomes the object of the meditation. And so if something just appears to you, or while you're in a meditative state, you get an ache in a part of your body or a sharp pain or whatever, you're supposed to pay close attention to that and only that thing for that moment. And what you do is then you don't judge it as good or bad. You just pay attention to it and you watch everything and you note everything, and then it's allowed to pass. And so it's impermanence and not self-seen. So this type of meditation really forces you to think about and recognize that all of these things will pass through your life. So that pain is going to go away at some point. The feeling of love or jealousy or whatever is not going to stay with you forever. And so it becomes sort of a voyage of discovery here. And as each of these things passes through, you focus on them and then you let them go and a new thing arises, you begin to understand yourself, and you dismantle selfhood, which is basically the purpose of Buddhism, that you begin to dismantle all the parts of your selfhood and ultimately achieve nirvana or nothingness. So the Buddhists believe that meditation is the principal means through which greed, hatred, and delusion or ignorance can be uprooted. And central to delusion is the belief that we have an unchanging ego that is placed at the center of all things. to be protected, promoted, and pampered. And so in Buddhist meditation, what we believe as the self, we eventually learn is impermanent or empty. And so you notice one thing right here, if any of you have ever studied Freud at all or psychoanalysis, you would notice that this is sort of in direct contradiction to that, because these things that Freud talks about would run against what a Buddhist in the notion of these things being impermanent would be. All right, I'm going to stop there, open it up for any questions that you may have.
I actually had a question about karma.
Okay.
So you mentioned that the whole desire of achieving nothingness sort of drives the whole backing of Buddhism. So do you try to find the balance between the good and the bad karma in order to find the nothingness in Buddhism?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Danny. So remember, the Buddha ultimately is seeking this middle way, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to accumulate karma. Now, obviously, in Buddhism, unlike in Hinduism, where you want to eliminate karma totally,
Mm-hmm.
right? In
Yeah.
Buddhism, you want to accumulate good karma, okay?
Gotcha.
But without desire.
Okay.
You understand?
Yeah, no, I feel you.
So that part they share with Hinduism, because remember, desire in Hinduism is bad as well. But in
Right.
Buddhism, you want to accumulate as much good karma as possible.
Okay.
And that's why morality is highly regarded in Buddhism, particularly for the lay practitioners. The monks tend to already do many of the things that would gain them good karma anyway, but lay people try to do these things in order to gain good karma. Because basically what good karma does is it helps to alleviate suffering for other people.
Okay.
You see how that's going to work?
Yeah, okay.
And alleviating suffering is the ultimate goal of Buddhism.
Right.
And so by not cheating or lying, you're going to alleviate some suffering for another person by giving.
Which makes it easier for them to do it.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Which is why this notion of the loving kindness, the more that spreads out, it makes it easier for other people to engage in that same practice. So in that way, karma functions differently than it does in Hinduism.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, thanks for explaining.
Other questions there?
I don't think so.
No, well, from any of our
Not for
other
anyone, yeah.
fellow voyagers?
I'm good.
All right. John, you good?
Good.
Bo, you good?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. So we will regroup on Friday, and Friday we will look at religions of Oceania, and mostly we're going to focus on Australia, and so Aboriginal traditions and so forth. I am going to upload some documents, some chapters from a book, which is where the notes will come from for that lecture. But that will help you really when you have to do your final paper on Oceanic religions. So it's quite convoluted, more so than Hinduism was. So I'm just going to put that out there. And we're only going to have one day on it. But the material that I'll upload will help you, and you'll be able to get some reference points from some other things as well. So have a great day, and we'll see you all on Friday. And Danny, I'll see you later.
Yep.
All right. Take care, everyone.